All right, welcome to the second virtual uh, roundtable. I would call it a virtual conference, of the E4M DNPA dialogues. Earlier, some days back, we had the first conversation in our two-part series, which will culminate into a physical event in the early 2023. Mr. Avinash Pandey, CEO, ABP Network. Briefly, I want to talk about Mr. Pandey. He's the CEO of ABP Network, which runs 6 news channels, 10 digital channels, and a successful film production company, ABP Studios. He's also the president of News Broadcasters and Digital Association, NBDA.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow travelers of the digital universe. It is indeed my pleasure to be here today to open up this dialogue on the scope of ideal relationship between digital news publishers and the big tech platforms, and how, more importantly, the nature of this relationship can impact the field of journalism as a whole. As most of you notably know, that about 4 years ago, DNPA, or Digital News Publisher Association, was launched with an aim to define, create, and foster the emerging digital news ecosystem. It represents 17 leading media houses of the country, which contributes to almost 80% of the digital news content. And we are here at the second edition of DNPA Dialogue with some of the best international thought leaders of the day to discuss the issue involved in creating an ideal relationship between the news publisher and tech platforms in rebuilding the business of journalism.
Now, I would like to invite Mr. Puneet Jain to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Jain is the CEO of HT Digital News, responsible for growing HT Media's overall presence in digital.
Once again, welcome to this inaugural edition of DNPA Dialogues. I am Puneet Jain, CEO of HT Digital. DNPA Dialogues aim to foster an open discussion among various stakeholders in the news ecosystem in India, from publishers to government to regulators, big tech, and of course our users. The theme of today's conversation is the relationship between big tech and digital news publishers and how it impacts journalism in the country. Under this theme, we had the first dialogue last week, where we had subject matter experts from Australia sharing their perspective and progress they have made in their relationship with big tech. Continuing from the same, today we are excited to have guests from Canada and US. On that note, let me, without further ado, let me invite Mr. Taylor Owen, who is the director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy. He's also the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communication and associate professor in the Maxwell School of Public Policy at McGill University. So, Mr. Taylor, look forward to an engaging conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. And Paul and Courtney, it's nice to be here with you guys too. So look, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about what's been going on in Canada regarding this latest piece of public policy addressed at journalism. Paul, I'm sure, can go into it in more detail, but I thought I could just kind of sketch the landscape in which it was introduced, how it's differed a little bit from the Australian model, which you talked about last week, and how some of the debate is played out about it in Canada, because I think it's quite telling how various actors have responded to the introduction of this bill in Canada. But first, I think there's some attributes. I mean, obviously, every journalism ecosystem has similarities and differences, and a couple of things are important at the moment in the Canadian media ecosystem that are relevant to I think the tabling of this bill and how it's being received. One is, of course, just the decline in Canadian news publishers that we're seeing in other markets. I mean, there's nothing particularly unique about the Canadian news market, except that it has been a more difficult space for independents and digital companies to emerge than I would argue the US, in part because of the nature of digital commercial models for journalism that demand a certain kind of scale that Canada just hasn't been able to. Google has used, in my view, and these are my personal beliefs here, in my view, a strategy that sought to divide publishers against each other in response to this bill. So they have been engaging with and supporting networks of small and independent publishers, and with them making the argument that this bill will disproportionately advantage the large publishers and legacy publishers. I think there's a reasonable debate about that. I think many of the facts on which they are making that debate are wrong and are not reflected in the bill. I think Paul can probably speak to this in more detail than I can. But in my view, it's quite telling about the role they see themselves having in this ecosystem, that really they are fostering what has become quite a acrimonious debate between journalistic publishers, which is a pretty unfortunate consequence of the debate we've had in the last year in Canada over this bill. Facebook has done essentially what they threatened to do in Australia and are threatening to do in the US as well, which is to turn off access to news links on their site should the bill come to pass. They have made this in public and in front of parliamentary committee in Canada, so it seems like an official position. We can talk about what the consequences of that are. My view is I'm not sure it's possible. I think it may be possible in one market with a small set of publishers. I'm not convinced of the logistics, let alone the strategy of doing it in multiple markets around the world, and how that would even be possible. But that's the threat. It's on the table. Another reaction, which has been interesting, and I think shows you goes back to one of that initial points I made, which was that some publishers have deals, is some publishers who have deals no longer have the same kind of support they may have once had for this piece of public policy, which actually I think shows you the reason why those deals were put in place in the first place. If one has a deal with Facebook or Google that it lasts some number of years, and that puts you at an advantage over your competitors who do not have them, you might be less likely to support a policy that will democratize or open up access to the very same deal you have. And we've seen that, which is pretty unfortunate in my view, for a host of reasons. And I think actually the publishers and Google in this case particularly are to blame for this end result. And so in closing, I don't think Google cares and Facebook care about the Canadian market and 40 million people in Canada. But if in the next year, South Africa, Germany, the UK, Brazil, and others potentially all implement a similar policy, that really does start to matter. You're then in a universe where there's 1 billion or 2 billion people under some sort of similar policy framework. And you better believe that matters. And that could lead to billions of dollars of transfer from publishers, from platforms to publishers, which makes me feel like if that's going to happen, we better ensure that the mechanism through which that money is being transferred from these large platforms to publishers is done so in a way that is as accountable and democratic as possible. Because that's where our attention should focus, is on ensuring these bills have accountability, transparency, and some degree of democratic legitimacy built into them. And I think the Canadian one gets that, moves that ball forward a little bit.
You mentioned something that Facebook actually is removing the link of the publishers. So how do you think? I mean, what are the authorities doing meanwhile when the bill is in the process of getting passed? I mean, how are these kind of things dealt with?
Well, they haven't done it yet. They're threatening to do it.
They're threatening to do it. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, they're threatening to do it. And I mean, I'm not sure honestly, I'm not sure what it looks like if they do it. I think it's probably fairly easy for them to do it with a clear list of publishers. I assume they would just block links to those publishers. The thing is that the bill applies to a very large range of organizations, though. And so maybe in one market you can do it, but it will be very difficult to implement in many markets together. And what does that do to their product, frankly? I mean, I don't know. Facebook newsfeed is, or Instagram are all having their challenges at the moment. And if you turn off the ability of people to share news content, I'm not sure what that strategically does, honestly, to their product, but
Yeah.
I guess that's not my business.
So with that, I want to thank you, Professor Owen, and I want to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Paul Deegan, to take this discussion forward. Quickly, Mr. Deegan is President and Chief Executive of News Media Canada, the voice of the print and digital media industry in Canada, representing hundreds of trusted news titles. Over to you, Mr. Deegan.
Great. Thank you so much, Rohail, and greetings from Toronto, Canada, where it's, I believe we're something like 23 degrees colder than where you are in Delhi right now. So it's a little chilly here, but pleasure to be with you. We certainly have, many ties between Canada and India. We have 1.4 million Indo-Canadians. And, we've got lots of educational exchanges and things like that. So I think it's, this is a really opportune forum for us to learn from each other. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. In terms of the, just where we're coming from, so News Media Canada, we represent about 570 titles across Canada. And just to give you a sort of a sense of the breadth of the membership, I would say roughly a third are, very large publications, whether an individual title or large chains. We've got another third, which are, I would say, sort of mid-sized chains and larger independents. And then we've got another third, which are really truly independents, very small. They may have a few employees. Some of them are literally, some sort of mom and pop type enterprises that are producing, a newspaper that serves a community of 1,200 or something like that. So we go from the very large to the very small. In Canada, we've seen hundreds of news outlets have been shuttered over the past decade. We've had thousands of journalists, not just in print media, but in radio and television, have been let go. So it's really a very difficult market for news. But at the same time, the content that our journalists produce has great value to our readers and to the web giants. So despite the challenging circumstances, I think everyone's really done a terrific job in terms of producing high quality news. Now, obviously, for that news, our belief is that we should be compensated by the platforms, and there is a significant imbalance of power between the tech giants and the Canadian news outlets and news outlets around the world. So we wanted the government to act, and the government itself has wanted to act, and I think has been noodling this for at least 5 years or so, trying to figure out the best way to do this. So the question is, how do you do it? So as Taylor mentioned, one of the ways is simply to tax it and putting the money in a fund. We have concerns with that in terms of the level of government intervention, where you essentially are getting into more of a situation where you've got the government picking winners and losers. So we don't see that as a viable option. The second would be to go the copyright route, which is long and complex. And to be honest, if that were to take, I don't know, 5 or 10 years to deal with, we're not going to have enough publishers around if we wait that long. And then the third way is essentially to, try to address it through competition policy. And that's essentially where we've landed. So in the summer of 2021, the governing party, which is the Liberal Party, in their election platform, they proposed that we follow the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, which was still in its infancy at that point. Most of the other parties in Parliament were in broad agreement on it. One of the parties was looking, I think, more in terms of going the copyright route, but generally, I think there was reasonable consensus that this was a good approach. So we were very pleased earlier this year. Pablo Rodriguez, who's the Minister of Canadian Heritage, introduced C18, the Online News Act, in the House of Commons. And this legislation was used for a number of reasons. First of all, the need for strong independent local press has never been greater. It keeps us connected, whether it's covering city hall, provincial governments, territorial governments, our national government. It's very important that we hold these institutions accountable.
So we quickly want to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Courtney Raj. Dr. Raj is a PhD fellow at UCLA's Technology, Law and Policy Institute and the US representative for Article 19. I want to hand it over to you, Dr. Raj. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'd like to take a step back. I recently authored a report called Making Big Tech Pay for the News They Use, and I did a global review of all of the legislation and regulation being proposed or even discussed around the world. And so I want to talk about the different types of approaches, as well as the specific issues that I would suggest policymakers should be considering. There's an overarching aim to improve media viability and sustainability. Obviously, that's critical in democracies and elsewhere. And ultimately, the goal is to generate new revenues or subsidies for news outlets, and those end up having different types of solutions in terms of the policy solutions. So there are essentially 5 main policy areas that these various different approaches kind of pick and choose from. So one is taxation. And a key assumption kind of underpinning that is that, the revenues that are accruing to these tech companies are not being adequately, obviously, allocated to news outlets that are producing, as has been mentioned, really high quality content. And I would just say that this idea that, Facebook keeps saying, only 3% of traffic is to news. I think we have to disabuse them of that notion. And it disregards the fact that they are funding fact checking a lot on their platform. So obviously they want high quality news. So we need to get rid of that, that rhetoric. I think we still do not have good evidence, and this is where the media can come in about the actual link there, and I'll get into that in a moment. So essentially, policymakers have coalesced around interventions that focus on taxation, intellectual property, competition law, which means giving people different bargaining rights, requiring platforms to pay licensing fees, requiring them to negotiate for that, taxing digital advertising and using the resulting revenues to subsidize publishers, and subsidies paid directly or indirectly to news outlets, for example, through citizen vouchers or tax credits, and mandating transparency from platforms.
I will ask just one question, and any 3 of you panelists can answer that. We spoke about the importance of local media. We spoke about the importance of conventional media and having a fair share of the revenue. And these changes that is happening in our world currently is done through legislations. Is there a way that we can convince the big tech, saying that it's not in our mutual interest to keep fighting? And can we arrive at some revenue share or some understanding which should be universally applicable globally, irrespective of the platform?
Do you want me to take that? Sure. So I guess what I would say is, I think it's helpful if we move to some sort of global standard, but I think ultimately we do need to have legislation, to make sure that there's sort of the teeth behind this. We've got, right now, at least from our experience, we've seen this sort of, basically picking the large players and excluding a lot of the small, and that's not healthy. So, I believe we do need the legislation. I think, if we could move to some sort of, model globally, and I think Australia has provided a good basis for the rest of us to build on. And as Courtney just said, I think, we need this sort of global cooperation. We're all learning from each other. We're still in the very early days of this, but I do think that, voluntary agreements aren't going to cut it, that we do need legislation globally.
All right, I have some questions here, from the audience. Let me start. So it's open. It's an open forum here. So anyone, wishes to answer is to all of you. First question is, how can the interests of smaller media houses and big media houses, who are often competing, be brought together on matters concerning big tech?
I mean, I think if I may intervene on that, I mean, I think one of the key factors should be that, the news industry needs to be focused on coming together with these proposals and being part of the discussions and leading those discussions. And, there need to be, I think, fora of trust and confidential fora for large and small media organizations to collaborate. And I do think that part of this, I think both as Paul and Taylor alluded to, this isn't just about news revenues. It really is about a fundamental pillar of democracy and a fundamental part of the infrastructure of democracy. And so, if we can get beyond kind of the parochial individualized interest of any one company and try to really make this about more than just that, so that the big publishers, I do think, need to be more explicit about their recognition that, what they get, they need to think more broadly about the community of media in the country, not just about themselves. And I would say we need to do this at a global level as well. So as we're thinking about some sort of kind of global standards, I mean, the fact is, like, Botswanan media or media in Lebanon are never going to have the influence or power to really put in place any sort of meaningful legislative framework. And so we need US, Europe, Canada, India, these influential, powerful actors to really do a good job of designing their frameworks so that there is a template there and it can potentially provide a broader framework for media globally as well.
Great. And thanks, Dr. Khatni. I think this was a very engaging discussion. We understood from how the economic balances in the publisher and big tech relationship, and how I think the Canadian bill is building from Australian bill to address this, and the actions in the US to also address the same. I think on that note, I just wanted to. I think Dr. Khatni, I'll perhaps research to understand the blueprint. You literally gave a blueprint of how, let's say, India could go about it. That was, again, very, very insightful. On that note, I will pass on to Ruhail. If you have any questions, and a lot of questions are still there, please go ahead. I know we are under pressure.
We have exactly 3 minutes. So one final question to Avinash ji. Maybe Puneet, you can also join us there. What is the way ahead for Indian publishers regarding this, publisher big tech equation? A quick concluding remark from both of you.
Yeah, I think if I can go ahead and Avinash, please add. I think as we understand from developments all across the world, one, of course, there are, let's say, economic imbalance that must be addressed, right? So while I think we should continue to engage both with big tech as well as the other government participants to understand, come to a common ground. But at the same time, what I'm hearing is our panelists say that perhaps a legislative support is important to address the imbalance. Without that, it's and a voluntary one may be limited to solve the challenge at hand.
Thank you, everyone, for making this happen, for joining this. Thank you, DNPA and Exchange for Media, for making these conversations happen.